welcome on behalf of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. Terrific to see such a great turnout tonight. Those of you who are interested in cultural geography might help me answer the question, why does the South Australian branch of the Academy of the Social Sciences run the best events? And why can't anybody get their act together in Sydney and Melbourne? Is it simply a matter of urban geography? Interesting question, an interesting question to ponder. Now, in thinking about Barbara's topic tonight, not that of course I've seen the text of the lecture yet, I was struck in my flight from Brisbane this morning with the kind of thing that a social scientist can do with the August in-flight magazine for Qantas. And this of course, like all good social science, mixes high theory with absolute empiricism. In the August edition, there are 5 ads for extraordinarily expensive watches. You know, the sort of watches that most of you, I hope, have, that never seem to cost less than, $5,000. It might cost 50 with diamonds. So, 5 full-page ads for watches. However, 10 full-page ads for MBA degrees at Australian universities. Of these 10 full-page ads, 4 feature single blonde women, fairly obviously in their 20s or 30s. 2 feature brunettes, a little bit near my own age. 2 feature males. 1 from UTS features its new handsome building, and the one from the University of Queensland Business School features a shot of women in the slums of Delhi. Now, I won't go on to editorialise about how universities make these sorts of marketing decisions, but it's extraordinary to think about what's happened to the universities in that sense, if we're now out-polling the ads for watches. Now, most of you will be well aware, of course, of Fay Gale's career as a cultural geographer. She was very important as an advocate of equal opportunity and a champion of Aboriginal rights. She was, when she was a professor of geography at the University of Adelaide, it was at that time still very unusual for a woman to be in a full chair. She served as Vice-Chancellor at the University of Western Australia, and she was the first female president of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia in 1987, and the Fay Gale Lecture was established and has run since 2008 as an annual lecture, and normally it's given in 2 places, one here in Adelaide, which is very appropriate, obviously, and Barbara is kindly braving Brisbane on Thursday night. Okay, now we're getting an introduction to Barbara.
Thank you. Wow, where do I start? Barbara Pocock, my friend. I first heard of Barbara 15 or so years ago. I was at home trying to finish my PhD, and this strange person made a phone call, and I was listening to a very long message on my answering machine offering me a job, I think. Well, actually, what I think I was being offered is to write a course, a research methods course, perhaps with some teaching attached to it. I didn't know who this person was. And at that stage, I'd never written a course. I was still trying to finish my PhD, and I'd never taught a class in the social sciences. Could I do it? I came to the conclusion, why not? It's an opportunity. And this is something that I have in common with Barb. I did write the course, but I actually can't recollect whether we co-taught it together or not. But that was my introduction to Barb, how she worked, and why I'm here today. I'm not going to talk about Barb's varied and illustrious achievements, but perhaps what has underpinned them in a very short period of time. And I probably won't do justice, but I'll do the best I can. And of course here I'm talking about the qualities and characteristics of Barb that I admire greatly. Energy and engagement. Barb has bucket loads, and when you're working with her, you really do go for a ride, and it's an amazing ride. Dynamism and capacity to think outside the square. Not only is Barb pragmatic, but she gets change. Barb is a big picture person, and that's often a rarity in institutions like this. Yet it's one of the qualities of being a leader. Barb isn't the type of person who believes in things staying the same because it's easier. Barb's prepared to take risks. And again, you only have to look at her resume to get a picture of just the varied opportunities and chances and risks that Barb has made. And as a mentor, Barb has enabled the careers of many people, and across different fields. A capacity and willingness to bring a range of people together. And again, you only have to look at the various grants that Barb has secured over the many years, and the involvement of big business, communities, NGOs, and of course, union bodies. But I would like to say just a little bit about Barb's research and the things that I guess I really do admire about Barb's research. It has always been applied. It has always been on understanding the social world. It is always about research that seeks to make a difference, both in terms of positive change and the common good. And I've learnt a lot about research and the responsibilities involved because of my experiences with Barb. There is no question that in her time at Adelaide, and I guess the UniSA, Barb has made an impact. In her professional career, Barb has packed a lot in. When I read through the many achievements, the grants, publications, the awards, where Barb has travelled as a visiting scholar or as a public commentator in the media, I think, yep, that's Barb. Full on, and she gets things done. Thank you.
Just get this technology functioning. How's that? You can hear me okay? Great. Thank you so much, Megan, Peter and Sue, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here, and yeah, I just want to begin, like Peter, acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I recognise and respect their cultural heritage, their beliefs, their relationship with the land, and that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living here today. I also want to acknowledge the wonderful contribution of Fay Gale over many years in this institution and beyond. Her life was just a series of firsts. It's never easy to be the first woman in so many things. She was the first leader of the Academy and made a wonderful contribution herself to Aboriginal studies and to geography. So I feel very honoured to be speaking here in her name. I also thank the Fay Gale Centre and the University of Adelaide and the Academy for hosting this event, and for all of you coming out on this night to hear this talk. And my debts to my colleagues, Dr. Natalie Skinner and Professor Sarah Charlesworth and Professor Paula McDonald, will, I hope, be obvious as I go through this. I want to begin by telling you about a trip I took at the beginning of this year. I went to New Zealand to attend an annual conference about work that I'd been going to for decades. When I went to register, there'd been some glitch in the universe and my registration had gone astray. In my newly retired state, I had stepped away from university 6 months before, I paused. Perhaps I was meant to do something different in New Zealand. I said goodbye to my wonderful, if slightly quizzical academic colleagues, and I walked back to my hotel, packed a small bag, hired a car and drove 500 kilometres south to a tiny little town. I wanted to take a look at the place where working life had begun for me 42 years earlier. What would I remember? What did my 42-year cycle of work at its beginning and end in New Zealand have to say to me, if anything? As I drove, This is one of the many, many beautiful shearing sheds in New Zealand. As I drove, I reflected on where work had landed me. Can you see it? Yeah. And my generation, and where it lands women today. I began my formal working life in 1973, so long ago, when I first went to New Zealand to work as a rousey in shearing sheds. I was 17, and I never threw a fleece like this. That takes skill. That is not me. Like most farm kids, I'd done plenty of farm work before that, but this was my first off-family farm job for real, and I had a real boss. Rouseabouts do the housework in shearing sheds. They clean up after shearers. They literally sweep up around them. They pen up the sheep, pack the bales, make tea for smoko. It can be hard work, and they sometimes do what academics now call emotional work in the sheds. That is, they keep things calm and pleasant. They try not to drop their broom. That's always a bottle of beer. And they have to listen to shearers a lot and sometimes take their abuse. So in January of this year, I drove those 500 kilometres to the little town of Howcombe that I've lived in for about 6 months in 1973, and I thought, where will I find my shearers? I walked into the front bar of this little pub, the only pub, of course, in Howcombe, which has a population of less than 500. And when I walked in, conversation between the 4 occupants paused. The publican asked me, what was I after? I told him I was looking for my old boss 40 years ago when I'd lived there. The pause deepened. Apart from the publican, it turned out, I was in the company of a wool presser who makes up the bales in a shearing shed, and 2 shearers. And it turned out they'd all worked for Graham Hughes, my boss, and they knew him well. In fact, they regaled me with every aspect of his private life in the 40 years since I'd seen him. We shared a beer. They took me back to their place, that's shearers for you, talking about shearing life today, and they'd been shearers themselves for 30 years, and both their daughters were rousies. We phoned all the Hughes in the phone book, and then some of their cousins, until we found Graham, who was now living 20 kilometres away. Next day I visited Graham, and we spent the afternoon together, catching up and exchanging life and labour market war stories. Memories crowded in. I had worked for 2 shearing contract teams in New Zealand, the first in a large travelling gang of mostly Maori shearers and shed hands who all lived in the shearers' quarters when they were on the job. I left this job in a hurry when, well lubricated with beer, some of the team tried to break into our room one night in the hopeful belief that rouseabouts had larger purposes than just picking up wool by day. I loved shearers for their humour and colour, but not that much. I knew that thin plywood door would only stand up for so much punishment. It was time to move on. My roommate and I packed up our bags and we walked to town. My second and longer term rouseabout job, which was about 5 months, was working in Graham's gang. Most of his shearers were farmers like him, shearing to supplement modest farm incomes. They were landholders and small businessmen, vigorously anti-union, as was I at the time, and they were great shearers. In fact, Graham is a gifted shearer. I was talking to my dad about this today, and he said yes, he was a gifted shearer. Late in 1974, Graham brought his team and their wives to Australia on a working holiday to shear my family's sheep. They used their New Zealand wide combs to do the job, creating a controversy in our little town. That's the shed they worked in, familiar to some of my family here. There were meetings in our town about using wide combs. New Zealanders use wide combs to shear, doing Australian shearers out of work and breaking down their working conditions. There were visits to the shed by the unforgettable Mr Plunkett, the AWU union organiser, subsequently became a Member of Parliament. The shed was declared black. It was stoned when we were inside it. Graham loved it all. He loved challenging the union organiser. He led him up and down the path. In fact, when I was in New Zealand in January, he reminded me that one night Bob Hawke rang him. He was president of the ACTU at the time and said, "Graham, I'm here to tell you, you need to go back to New Zealand because I can't guarantee your safety." And Graham, who had no idea who this guy was, said, "I've got a long line of sheds lined up, Bob. I'll be here quite a while." Total bullshit. He had no, he was out of there, you know, but he was a larrikin. He is a larrikin. I learned a lot about shearing in these years, and 4 decades later, the lessons remain relevant to the position of women, I think. Firstly, this is a wide comb that you're looking at. Hard to push through a merino. Firstly, for many, work is sweat. For a shearer, there is no escaping the gruelling task of catching, turning over, hauling out, shearing and then pushing a sheep down a chute. Up to 200 times a day, coping with all kinds of circumstances and bosses, all kinds of sheep. Daggy, small, large, pregnant, skinny, wet, prickly. Some of the bosses are a bit like some of those things too. So my first lesson was work can be hard. It can hurt. The realisation has stayed with me every day of my academic life, and it was very strongly with me, I found, for every one of the 420 days I worked in Parliament House in 2001 and 2 in Canberra, when I never saw a dirty, sweaty person except one night when I was working very late and someone was pulling up a carpet. It kept some academic and parliamentary complaints in perspective for me. Lots of people work hard. Most of them don't work as hard as a shearer or a rousey or a farmer. And some people create a lot of theatre about their work. You don't perform difficulty when you're a shearer, you do it. Second, people without recognised qualifications or skills, whether rousey or shearer, have little labour market power and they have to work hard to stay at work. Thirdly, collectivity matters. My farmer shearer bosses may have been anti-union, but no one was going to boss them past a certain point, and their pay was set by union members. They were paid union rates, and the larger formal worker collectivity of unionism, as well as their own brotherhood, put a floor under their working conditions. I didn't know that at the time. It took me a few years, and arriving in Sydney 6 years later in 1979 to work at the Reserve Bank with not much more than my economics degree in a suitcase, for me to realise that people really do need a safety net, and unions have been the main means to one in Australia since the late 1800s. Fourth, for many people, and this was really true in a shearing shed, work means much more than just money for people. It's a means to both fun, sociability and independence. And for many, work can be a pleasurable part of life and a foundation of community, on a good day, that is. Shearing sheds are full of tales and jokes and laughter, some of them in appalling taste. But it's a great antidote to hard labour and to tedium. Finally, and quite profoundly for me, work was different for men and women. It's different in its occupation, in its reward and in its power. And by and large, women do different jobs to men still. Women and men take their bodies to work in different ways in terms of their sexualisation, their vulnerability to harassment, the way their looks matter, and most importantly, their reproduction and responsibility for others beyond work while they're at work. Working mothers in shearing sheds, whether farmers, shearers or rousies, did not go to the pub or union meetings like men. They go home to the kids and they make smoko for the next day. 42 years later, I have worked in a lot of other jobs in that Reserve Bank, government, trade unions, universities where I learned some things. But these lessons have really stayed with me and stayed true. In this lecture, I want to reflect on the passage of those 4 decades since that shearing shed and what they've done and meant for women. I've always loved the poetic notion attributed to Mao Zedong that women hold up half the sky. But when it comes to the contemporary labour market and reviewing its evolution over recent decades, it is very evident that yes, women hold up half the sky at work and more than half of the sky beyond it. But the conditions of work continue to actively work against women. Women might hold up that sky, but we don't get half the returns, and we pay a high price in terms of maternal guilt, harassment and time pressure. We also get a great deal from work. Most women say they enjoy their work, they find it meaningful and rewarding, they enjoy their work-based social life. We have found economic independence through work and incalculable freedom to create our own homes and lives. I acknowledge all of that. However, I arrive at a view that a long-term guerrilla war is still being waged against equality for working women, and that is being remade and renewed even as we speak. We need to call it out loudly, and I want to argue that we need a new, different effort if it's to come to an end and its consequences cleaned up. So 4 decades on, where are we now? It's true at work now that women may hold up half that sky just in terms of participation. We've seen this slow merging of participation rates between men and women since the early 1980s. Women's participation has underpinned the overall slight rise in participation, and that growth is obvious across the age range, but nowhere more obvious than amongst older women. If we just pause on them for a moment. This is a graph for 60 to 64-year-olds, my age group. Their participation has increased threefold from 15% in 1993 to 45% now. For the first time, we have a generation of older women who have not only taken the same kinds of reproductive work of their grandmothers and mothers on, but have often held a job, a paid job as well, through those decades. And this is a first for our society in terms of the wide reach of that experience. Despite their decades of the double day, they approach their retirement years being told that they must work on longer, that we cannot afford their pension, and their superannuation balances, if they have them, and a third of them don't, are woefully inadequate. Their super might buy them a new car, but it certainly won't make much difference to retirement income. Most of the third of these women who have separated or divorced during their working lives will experience negative effects on their housing and their retirement resources, and many will be involved in the care of their children's children as they themselves increase their participation. This increase in paid work for women has been especially pronounced amongst women in their most intensive caring years, from 20 to 50. As we've scooped women from home into the workplace, so that women today, in terms of participation in work over the life cycle, look a lot like men. So this is the participation rate by age in 1966, from people who are 15 to 19-year-olds right through until they're 65 plus. And we see men are in the labour market, you know, for almost 100% of men are in the labour market over that long span, whereas in 1966 women stepped away and they never stepped back. And now we look at 2011. Effectively, what we've done is a transformative change for our society. This means that we now expect women to work for most of their lives, to behave like men in this respect. Sure, many work part-time, almost 1 in 2, but they are expected to have a job, to work outside home. At the same time, their responsibility for domestic work and care has remained too little changed. While men have upped their domestic work contributions mainly through a few more minutes a day on childcare, though we actually know less and less about this because the ABS are now no longer collecting the data about who does housework, and women have lowered their standards and are doing a little less. However, overall, women still do twice as much domestic work as men, and that's an international fact. Overall, counting both paid and unpaid work, women work more than men by about an hour a week. The fact that women's work sits across multiple spheres and involves unpredictable care and home means that conflict or overlap with the often rigid boundaries of work means that they're caught in a demanding juggle. So it's not just about the length of hours, which objectively women do slightly more than men. It's really about the nature of the worlds of time that women also have to put together. This means they experience levels of time pressure that are much higher than for men. 4 in 10 women feel often or almost always rushed and pressed for time, compared to 3 in 10 men. But the gap is really wide once you become a parent. Sorry for those who are anticipating such a thing. And for mothers and carers, this feeling is much more widespread. 7 out of 10 working mothers say they are rushed and pressed for time almost always, compared to 5 out of 10 working fathers. Negative work-life interference is much more pronounced for working mothers and fathers, and especially high amongst sole mothers. Unfortunately, while women and mothers have stepped up to work, the institutional adaptation to women's changing worker identity has been far from complete, both at home and in the workplace. It has been partial, tentative, hotly debated at every turn, and despite advances, the deep inequalities between men and women jump out from the data. I'm not going to speak about the paid parental leave debacle. I can't bring myself to call it a debate. But the terminology of calling women double dippers because they access paid parental leave from both their employers, government and their own savings, and leave in many cases, is a salutary example. We have a similar 3-pillar approach to that other working life policy. Paid parental leave is a working life, working time policy. Retirement, it's very similar. In retirement, people draw on their employer contributions to super, a government payment, the pension, and other savings. But no one would think to call someone who leans on all 3 pillars a double dipper. The coalition government's confected outrage is especially insulting when we acknowledge that the paid parental leave was designed by the Productivity Commission to increase people's access to paid parental leave to a reasonable international standard over time across those three pillars. To protest that some women get more money than others never bothered anyone much in relation to the very wide disparity in retirement incomes or wages in Australia. But it cannot be allowed in a system which is essentially available for women. It's the gender of the recipient that makes this policy so bitterly and often so ignorantly contested. But I digress. I want to ask, are the significant continuing disadvantages that women experience in Australian workplaces just the legacy of history, working their way through the system over time? Surely with women now so significantly out-qualifying men, it's only a matter of time before the workplace gender gaps close. With a 20% gender gap in university graduates, as the Australian lamented yesterday, can't we just expect the pipeline or the market to fix things? Not if recent history is any guide. Why have we at best stalled and at worst gone backwards? The answer lies, I believe, in ongoing contemporary policy approaches that see working women as strangers to workplace norms, fostering new propositions that subtly refresh and remake discrimination against women. Things are resistant to change and perhaps increasingly difficult to call out because they are so subtle. I want to illustrate my argument through the latest review of workplace relations, the recently released Draft Productivity Commission's review of workplace relations in Australia. Stick with me, I know they're tedious, but I've got two issues I want to touch on. The Commission was asked by the Treasurer to review workplace law to identify future options to improve that law to maximise outcomes for Australian employers and employees. And most people agree that these are the draft report that's come out is a very mild document. It's true. The terms of reference did not mention women specifically. Those words did not cross Joe Hockey's lips, and the draft report released in early August does not make any serious direct analysis of women, beyond noting the increase in women's participation in paid work as a major change in our labour market. Its recommendations, however, have significant negative implications for women, and it misses entirely the opportunities to name and redress continuing gender inequalities in our workplace relations framework. It's silent on those. Given our time limitations, I'm going to talk to just two aspects of the report. Firstly, pay, and secondly, flexibility. I begin with this question of pay. While big advances were made in pay equity in the 1970s, just as I was beginning my working life, we've stalled in the past 20 years. In 1970, women earned only 59 cents in the male dollar. We're talking comparing full-timers to full-timers. But that rose to 70 cents in 1972 when I was heading into those shearing sheds. And by 1979, the figure was 80 cents in the dollar. However, the gender gap has now been stuck at around 83, 84 cents for 20 years. It's widened this year to reach its highest level in 20 years. We exclude in that analysis the impact of overtime, penalty rates, the effects of part-time work, differences in overall salary packages like differences in cars and super. All of those things favour men. If we just compare like with like, full-time, ordinary time earnings, women full-time now earn almost $300 a week less than full-time men. The gap is explained by many factors, including women's concentration in particular occupations and industries, gender bias and discrimination, the effects on women of taking time out to look after others and having fewer years in their occupation. The effects of these gaps are very significant over a lifetime of work. Over a 45-year career, this amounts to an average $700,000 difference for women compared to men, according to the ANZ Gender Equity Report released a week or so ago. AMP NatSem analysis shows that a 25-year-old woman with a bachelor's degree will over her lifetime earn around $2.14 million, while her male equivalent will earn $3.66. Anne Summers has called this the $1 million gender tax on women. In fact, it's over $1.5 million for graduates. Despite women's rapidly increased investment in their education, the fact that they outnumber people in classrooms like this, their pay has not shown an education dividend. So much for economists' theory of human capital. We've had to look at the subtle operation of economic, social, cultural, workplace and institutional factors to find explanations for this. Justice Mary Galdron, the first woman to be appointed to the High Court, is as right in 2015 as she was in 1979, when she famously said, "Equal pay was won in 1969, and again in 1972, and yet again in 1974, and we still don't have it." But wait, there is more. Our system has amplified this inequality in recent years. We transfer the imprint of this wage inequality directly onto our fairly recently invented retirement income system through wage-based percentage superannuation payments, which mean that a policy innovation implemented in only 1972 further entrenches the pay gap into retirement earnings, with the effect that women's average super balances in 2015 are just over half of men, and a third of women have no super at all, at least on 2012 figures. The superannuation gender gap will not disappear as the system matures. There is no automatic pipeline correction in view. Unlike in other countries that have introduced care credits to compensate for the time that women take from paid work to care for others. In Australia, this is the price of interrupting your career to care for kids or others, being paid less in female-dominated jobs and being discriminated against. As Elizabeth Broderick eloquently asks, is poverty to be the reward for a lifetime spent caring and working? What to do? We know that we can change this pay gap by more appropriately valuing occupations that are female-dominated, especially the rapidly expanding care system, by calling out and acting on discrimination and harassment, by supporting women in non-traditional occupations, industries and leadership, and by measuring, making transparent and addressing pay gaps within organisations. We know that workplaces that measure their gender pay gaps and make plans to narrow them can change them. And some do. However, the current government has weakened any government encouragement in this direction by reducing workplace gender equality reporting requirements, and the data tell us we are failing on the most basic performance indicator, the gender pay gap. Australia now has the 11th highest gender pay gap amongst 34 OECD countries, around 3 percentage points above the OECD average. The shift towards individualisation and more bargaining around your pay has not served women well in the last 20 years, where the individualisation is most pronounced, like in Western Australia, the gap is very wide, almost a quarter, 25%. The continuing strong occupational segregation of our labour market is also important. For example, only 16% of engineering graduates are women. Only 16% of people in the whole category of technical and trade occupations in the country are women. In the largest single trade occupation in Australia, that of electrician, women make up just 1.3% of the total in 2012. This is no different from the level in 1981, when I spent 2 years working for the New South Wales government to increase women's share of apprenticeships as the resources boom unfolded in the Hunter Valley. Total failure. Electricians are highly paid. If you're going to run arguments around body size and strength and so on, they just don't apply in the field of electricians. But the boundaries of the electrician trade are very difficult for women to penetrate. Gender segregation and its penalties in terms of pay and harassment remains a signature feature of our labour market. Management is also key to this. Many engineers, lawyers, IT professionals and managers point out that the major factor determining their workplace experience is the nature of their immediate boss and the culture they create. We have to change the capacities of these managers and make sure more of them are women, so that people don't need a visual prompt to see that an engineer or a surgeon can be a woman with kids, a woman who is as diverse as men in the way she looks or works or lives. So we know something of what we do, but we don't do much of it. Instead, each year our media hit us with the same, not very surprising, gender pay gap story. If I and many women in this room had $1 for every time we have been interviewed about the annual shock horror gender pay gap, we could probably have fixed the gender pay gap personally. Instead of fixing it, we can see how the persistent gap is furthered through the workplace relations discussion today. Take the question of Sunday penalty rates, which received a great deal of attention and specific recommendations from this year's Productivity Commission draft review. While having nothing to say about the contemporary gender issues, such as the gender pay gap and its widening and what a decent workplace relations framework should do about it, the Productivity Commission instead went for Sunday penalty rates. The current government and many employers want to reduce penalty rates. The Productivity Commission has actively championed their case in this report, with a recommendation that those rates on Sundays should be reduced, but not in all industries, just in cafes, restaurants, entertainment and retailing, and that these should be cut to Saturday levels. There is no discussion in their lengthy draft reports, 1,000 pages, about the gendered impact of this change. Instead, it takes a hatchet to those Sunday penalty rates in those particular industries, a move that will have the effect of widening the real gender pay gap in pay, given that women are much more likely to work in these industries than any others. Women make up 55% of accommodation and food services industry employees and the same proportion in retail, while only comprising around 45% of the total labour market. These two industries are really big. 15% of all non-managerial employees in 2014 worked in retail and 10% in occupation and food services. The average hourly cash pay is $10 an hour less than in other industries, and many workers in these sectors are not actually even paid their penalty rates, but leave that aside. Productivity Commission had nothing to say about that problem. Very large numbers of workers in these two industries work on weekends. 36.5% of retail workers and 29% of accommodation food services workers work only on weekends. A cut in penalties for these disproportionately female low-paid workers will have a very significant effect on their pay packets. There is no recommendation to reduce penalty rates in emergency services, construction, manufacturing, mining, IT, transport or the power industry. Why? Because in the minds of the Productivity Commissioners, penalty rates in these male-dominated industries are, and I quote, justifiable. A further quote, they align with long-held community expectations. The typical working arrangements and job skills required in these industries. In other words, in an entirely subjective line of reasoning which reflects nothing more than the heavy weight of history, which is a phrase this the Productivity Commission really like in this report. They really don't like the heavy weight of history. They think the institutions have been in there mucking things around, and if only a bunch of clear-thinking economists could fix it, it would be done properly, not subjectively. They are actually, in their own commentary, very much subjective and reflecting their own heavy weight of masculinist history, very far from the analytical rigour these commissioners purport to favour. These norms must not be disturbed. They are justifiable. They are typical. The community expects them. They are norms. These perceptions are all gendered. We can contrast this with the Fair Work Commission's recent decision to retain penalty rates for workers in the restaurant industry because of the particular impact on low-paid workers, pointing out such a change would reduce pay for Sunday retail workers by as much as 17%. In an industry where most workers are award-dependent, lack bargaining power and are not in unions. They're disproportionately women and they're poor. Or they live in, well, some of them live in households with larger amounts of money. Many of them are students, but they are low paid in their hourly rate. Such a move, the Fair Work Commission concluded, did not sit well with the object of a fair and relevant safety net that takes account of relevant living standards and the needs of the low paid. No such concern for the Productivity Commission in their draft report, however, no attention to the gendered impact of what they propose, despite submissions from various parties who pointed it out, St Vincent de Paul, Textile Clothing and Footwear Union. If it were not so potentially damaging to so many low-paid women and men, the subjective basis of their recommendation and its gendered partiality would be laughable. Instead, the Productivity Commission argued that because retail and hospitality services have grown and more people want to use them on Sundays, we should cut pay premiums that compensate retail and services workers' pay while preserving the specialness and penalties for Sundays for workers in male-dominated industries. In constructing their argument, the Commission cites the Australian Work and Life Index, data that I and my colleague Natalie Skinner at the University of South Australia have collected since 2007. The Productivity Commission accurately cite the AWALI findings, that's the Australian Work and Life Index findings, that show that work-life interference is significantly worse for people who work on weekends and especially on Sundays, relative to Saturdays. This supports an argument it shows the relative damage. This is survey responses from around 3,000 workers a year through successive surveys. There is a strong case for a premium for Sundays. Sundays are different in the minds and experience of workers. There are very large differences in the AWALI scores between Saturday and Sunday. My colleague Professor Sarah Charlesworth has undertaken further analysis of this data in relation to retail workers in particular, and she found that they were no different from workers in other industries in that regularly working on a Sunday is associated with worse work-life interference than on a Saturday. So retail workers do not love working on a Sunday. They are not uniquely built for working on a Sunday compared to construction or manufacturing workers. However, despite their gender. However, the Productivity Commission give the AWALI evidence about Sunday no weight. They quote it and they never mention it again. Instead, they offer an analysis of the individual AWALI components. AWALI is made up of 5 different measures about time and do you miss out on your family and community and so on. They break down those components of AWALI and they choose only 4 of them. They leave one out without any explanation. The one they leave out is this: how often does your work affect your ability to develop or maintain connection or friendships in your local community? Kind of think that might be relevant to Sundays, but no mention of it. For some reason they choose another 4. Even the 4 that they choose to analysis, 2 of them show Sundays have greater disability, disamenity associated with them than Saturdays. 2 of them show the reverse. It's a long story, but basically they choose to just take the 2 that favour their argument. Their own analysis does not bear out that on 2 of the 4 measures, more Sunday workers find that work interferes with outside activities and more find it interferes with family and friends than people working on Saturdays. However, in their overview report, forget all that stuff that's back in the appendix, this becomes, quote, survey evidence shows that the overall social costs of daytime work on Sundays are similar to Saturdays. Hardly accurate. Their approach of removing the effect, then they do when they do that analysis, they also control for gender and for presence of small children. Their approach of removing the effects of gender and care for young children in their analysis is particularly baffling, given that care responsibilities and gender are critical drivers of work-life interference. It's very odd to wash their effects out of their analysis. It is precisely gender and care responsibilities that are likely to make work-life an issue on Sundays. If only so many of these workers were not women and were not parents, there really would be no problem. And you can do your analysis that way. In this conception, being a woman remains strange to the favoured norms of our labour market institutions and their reformers. Once we turn everyone into a carefree, genderless being, the problem is, if not disappeared, then at least significantly reduced. An argument that Sunday workers have worse life interference only because so many are women or parents is unconvincing, given that these are such important determinants of exactly the issue of work-life conflict. This does not stop the Productivity Commission from ignoring the overall AWALI evidence about work-life interference for those who work on Sundays and blithely recommending the removal of penalty rates for industries where so many workers are women and carers. Implementing this draft recommendation would widen the gap between women and men's pay and conditions because its effects would fall disproportionately on women. In 10 years' time, researchers would be pointing back to this decision and to the widening gender pay gap, a bit like those women who warned against a percentage-based superannuation system did in 1992, and can now quite rightly say, I told you so. More annual shock horror, the gender pay gap has widened stories and more newspaper sales, but no change. This account is salutary for another reason also. Every student in an Australian university should receive a cautionary lecture about spending decades of their life collecting data to illuminate problems and then having it served back to them in perverse ways. This is not an argument against collecting data or having a fabulous research life, but it is an argument for being prepared for its strange use when you share it. I want to briefly explore a second issue that's vital for working women, that is the question of flexibility at work. Once again, I want to take the way the Productivity Commission has dealt with this issue in its draft report as an illustration of the persistent, morphing, but steadily refreshed war on women at work. Every woman who becomes a working carer knows 2 things are vital, apart from a fabulous partner: a decent period of paid parental leave and the chance to have some say over where and when you work. This issue is of increasing importance to men with serious parenting responsibilities and the growing number of men and women who have responsibility for caring for older people and people with disabilities. Let's look at a very basic form of flexibility, the ability to influence your start and finish time, critical for a woman with a sick child unexpectedly in the morning, for example, and a father. Let's look at this latest Productivity Commission approach, which provides a good opportunity to assess whether we're going forward or backward on flexibility. And here's a table that they use in the report. The top blue line shows between 2006 and 2013 the proportion who do not have any say in start and finish times in the Australian labour market. That's 60% of people. No say over start and finish times. You would never think that was true when you hear the anecdotal conversation in much of our media about flexibility. The Productivity Commission include this table in their analysis, as I said, showing that there's been no change in 10 years. Sadly, this does not mean they recommend any change in this aspect of work regulation in Australia. For example, actually giving some teeth the kind of teeth that every other provision in our workplace relations law has, and that is some kind of redress to enable workers with caring responsibilities who ask for flexibility and get knocked back, have a place to go to contest a refusal. There are two very strange, if revealing, things about the take on this issue. Firstly, they ignore robust evidence about the fact the existing right to request in our National Employment Standard has had absolutely no discernible effect on flexibility request making by Australian workers. 20% of people asked for flexibility before the right to request was introduced, and 20% of people asked for flexibility after the right was introduced in the two large surveys that we've conducted since. Basically, those who feel secure about asking, ask, and mostly they get what they want. They have reciprocal, respectful relationships with their supervisors and employers, and they ask from a position of relative power. Those who do not have such power do not ask. Further, it's clear that many workers, around a third in our successive surveys, want more flexibility and do not ask. We call them discontented non-requesters. When we ask them why they don't request flexibility in qualitative research, they say because they feel insecure at work, they watched what happened to the last person who asked, or they work in places where they know they'll be knocked back and may well suffer a detriment as a consequence. For example, never get invited back for another shift. We conclude from our analysis of the right to request over the past 5 years that the existing right to request is not enlarging the proportion of workers who request flexibility beyond those who feel comfortable just asking before the legal right was introduced. It's odd that an inquiry that begs for clearer analytical frameworks and higher quality empirical research as a basis for decisions rather than the heavy weight of history makes so little use of evidence that's so readily accessible on so many issues. Instead, the Productivity Commission reject intervening further on the question of flexibility, and they say this is so because, and I want to quote a paragraph from their report, they say any obligations perceived to be costly by employers and that predominantly affect only one group of employees, e.g. women, may unwittingly lead to employment discrimination. There is therefore a risk that women may find their career and hiring prospects reduced by some employers without any real capacity to detect this. Moreover, to the extent that the provisions are seen as largely oriented to women, men may be reticent about even requesting to use such provisions. This paragraph tells us so much. Clearly, anti-discrimination legislation, which outlaws such behaviour in most states, carries no weight with the Productivity Commission, or perhaps such legislation is incredibly ineffective for many people. Perhaps they either don't believe it matters or they don't believe it works. Further, in their conception, we cannot adapt our labour market for specific groups of workers like women because such adaptations will be used against these categories. The ideal male worker squats squarely at the centre of this paragraph. In this conception, the category women, who now make up almost 1 in 2 of Australian workers and a far from exceptional, special or small group, are still seen as strangers to the norm, and they and their difference from men and those norms cannot be recognised in regulation because it will be used to illegally discriminate against the different, or horrors, if men are so foolish as to act like women and seek flexibility, they risk being contaminated by looking like women, the non-normal. Words fail me. There is so much wrong in this thinking. Someone has missed the memo that working women are the new normal. We hold up half the sky. No, we are not men, we are workers. Fortunately, years ago, we realised that working men and women are not the same and must be dealt with differently. For example, we recognised in 1979 that many workers who are women have babies, and they have had unpaid parental leave since then and paid leave for most since 2011. Conventional workplace institutions and the minds that inhabit them privilege male norms without any awareness that they're doing so. They ignore evidence about the ineffective of modest regulatory change like the right to request and condemn almost half our workers who just happen to be women to behave like childless, careless, ideal men if they're to work. This means pretending that you're a man without caring responsibilities or a female body, despite the fact that the demands of reproductive and caring cycles are so different from men's, and despite the fact that men actually can't exist unless women do this reproductive work. I want to just briefly say something about sexual harassment. Let's go back to that shearing shed and that fragile plywood door. Surely we have left the primitive practices of sexual harassment behind by now, and unfortunately not. We have much better information, however, about sexual harassment, and it's scary. Like many of you in this room, I've had experiences like this more than once. The hand on the knee and the proposition from my boss, 65-year-old boss when I was 26, and I was an equal opportunity officer in the Hunter Valley, please come back to my apartment, and a door bashing down by my well-lubricated male fellow unionists at Clyde Cameron College. Sadly, harassment knows no class boundaries. But we have got great data about how widespread sexual harassment still is in our labour market. 1/3 of women have been sexually harassed since the age of 15 in the labour market now, and something like, and a quarter of women have experienced sexual harassment in the workplace in the last 5 years. We might hold up half the sky at work, but we don't exercise the same freedom from violence, sexual comments and rigid gender and sexuality norms at work. We cannot keep making workplace relations changes that disadvantage women and continue to be surprised that there is no narrowing of the gender pay gap, no increase in the material conditions of inflexibility at work for many women, and no respite from relentless time pressures for women, and for many women, no relief from the possibility of sexual harassment. We cannot lament the unchanging ratios of women in every form of leadership in Australia, and in the same breath refuse to take action like set targets and quotas, and most importantly, plans to achieve them without expecting that things won't change. We know that work is good for women, it's good for our sense of contribution, competence, health, social connection. It's good. A big study out of Harvard of 50,000 women in 25 countries has shown that working women, their children, their daughters are more likely to be employed in supervisory roles and be paid more. Their sons are more likely to do more time on childcare and housework. Work is just good all round for working women in many cases, not all. But those of us, especially politicians and leaders, who exhort women to increase their participation in paid work, to invest in their skills and experience, to work for longer into old age, have a responsibility to shine the light upon and help change the terms of disadvantage that continue to affect women so negatively and so disproportionately, and which are flatlining or getting worse. The $1.5 million lifetime earnings loss for women with degrees relative to their male peers is not acceptable. The growing proportion of women in the labour market where less than half have meaningful flexibility, the shameful political football that our paid parental leave scheme has become, these are all signals that women are being taken for mugs. Of course, women are not mugs, but what to do? And I'm going to end by just making a couple of comments. I suggest we try and do more of three things. More of this. This is, I know there are engineers in the room, a woman whose picture was used for her company to recruit people to engineering in her firm, and she got a big kickback from people around her who told her, you do not look like an engineer. That is not how an engineer looks. Hence began this whole social media campaign of, I look like an engineer. It is fantastic. Just women saying, you may think they look like this, but we look like this. They look like all kinds of things. I build, break shit for Spotify's back end. Love that. They hold up what they do. Half of it you can't understand. And fabulous. Capitalism is wonderful. Walsh Engineering, some US lots of engineers, and they're all out there. So this is a great recruitment tool. So we need to do more organising. I want to also barrack for more research. We need really good research. We need research on sexual harassment, on pay, on conditions, on leave, on flexibility, on all forms of care work. The retirement system, the challenges that particularly affect those who challenge conventional norms of sexuality and the construction of gender. We need research on all of those things at the boundary of our knowledge, but it is not enough. And I say this as someone who spent 30 years doing it. If we're not doing this stuff with young women and organising at a community level to change what happens in workplaces, we're wasting our time. The third thing I think we need to do is to work much harder to hold our political parties accountable. We have the major political parties currently let women down in different ways and in different levels, but basically they are not listening and they are not acting. And it is not good enough if they want to build an economy increasingly upon women's labour. We need to also use social media in calling out the treatment of many of our young and insecure workers. You know this case, maybe some of you. This is a young worker in, that sells hamburgers, this chain. grilled, and consumers have fought back, having heard that this young woman has been underpaid, not paid penalty rates, $4,000 a year less than she should have, took her case up, and we'll see what happens in the Industrial Relations Commission. But one thing is clear to me: unless we do more of those things, nothing will change, because it's the right thing to do. It won't change because the evidence is strong. It won't change because gender disadvantage is getting us worse, or because gender bias and willful blindness in our institutions is diminishing. I'm really quite alarmed to find on this small piece of terrain that I've looked at tonight that things are not improving on so many fronts. A long-term guerrilla war is still being waged against fairness at work for women in institutions, and analysis that hold women strange and continues to expect them to meet archetypal male norms, norms that many men now cannot or do not want to meet even themselves. And this is continuing to expand inequality, which is being remade in significant ways around us. This is Annie Newmarch's fabulous, famous poster from 1978. If we're going to continue to hold up half the sky, we need a lot more institutional support and change to get anything like gender equality. If the young people in this room are to look back in their own 42 years in the middle of this century and observe real change in gender equality at work, we will need a much stronger and more effective political effort than my generation has been able to muster, to stimulate or to execute. And take it from me, we worked hard at it. Thank you. How are we going?
We do have time for a couple of questions before we're going to invite you to join us all for a drink, and I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to ask more questions when we're outside enjoying a drink and something to eat. But perhaps if we've got a couple of burning questions, we'll see if we can answer those now.
They do lie between us and wine.
Yes. Good point.
Not that I want to put you off.
So you have to speak in a loud voice.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, I feel quite privileged because I'm the first male to speak in a room that's dominated by women. So
that doesn't surprise us.
I enjoyed your talk, and as I was listening, one of the things, because there were so many topics that you brought up, but one in particular that I often thought about, and I really struggled to see how, as a society, we're going to solve this, is the flexibility of working hours for women, which is, I agree, is really important. But I look at where I'm working, I'm a teacher. How do we go about fixing that? Do we tell the students, you know, your class is going to be later today because Mrs. Such and such is got to look after her children? Can you come back and and stay an extra hour after work? I haven't heard anybody mention any really constructive solutions to this problem. Are there some? I mean, I totally agree with you that we've got to do something about it, but are there some constructive solutions to that?
Do you want to take a couple, or do you just want to do one at a time?
We'll just take two questions.
Okay. Yeah, actually, education is an industry where there is enormous flexibility. A lot of really smart people have thought exactly about the problem you've described, and there is enormous flexibility in the education workforce, and smart managers have worked out a lot of different ways to ensure a highly feminised labour market with a lot of care responsibility is able to work around a 5-day-a-week teaching program. So actually your case is one that manufacturing and construction and many other industries could learn a lot from. I would have, if you'd been a construction worker, now that is really challenging because the culture there is so resistant to allowing people to have Saturdays off in metropolitan Melbourne, for example. So I think it varies a lot by industry, and a bad manager can make a really big difference in a school or on a construction site, but there are a lot of really great solutions out there and a lot of flexibility in many places. So I think we've actually done a lot of good stuff on that.
Thank you.
I have a question, Mrs. Stewart.
You need to speak in a loud voice.
All right. I just want to say thanks, Barbara. That was fantastic, and a bit depressing because, as you say, it's same old, same old. But I was just want to ask you about the Productivity Commission's report about penalty rates and the way they've singled out really the women workers. I mean, surely that's partly because they know if they proceed against the male workers who are better unionised, there'll be a lot of fuss. And there's also a sense of male entitlement that those male workers would have. And so it's partly is about the poorer unionisation of women workers and family.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can comment.
Oh, I totally agree with what you're saying, Margaret. It goes back to those points in the shearing shed. Power is critical here, and these group of workers on retail accommodation are amongst the lowest paid, the least unionised and poorest, and very often highly insecure. Even if they're in ongoing employment, feel insecure. So I think that power issue means that it's easier to push over a target there than it is to change penalty rates working on a Sunday in a construction site or in other places. So yeah, that's really important. And I mean, fortunately, we have a Fair Work Commission that gets that. And there are passages in the Productivity Commission report where they also talk about relative power of workers to the employer. So there is an understanding and a sense, I think, a settlement that people deserve protection. But the push comes where it's most likely to win success, and this group of workers are least offended, amongst the least offended.